Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Make sure everybody's with us. What an honor and privilege to be here. I'm Caroline Elkins, and it's just, I look to my left and right, and it's all our friends. I mean, it's just wonderful, and thank you so much, Weatherhead, for organizing this for us all. I'm going to talk a little bit about this new doorstopper of a book, Legacy of Violence. And I want to start by thinking about what's been happening in contemporary Britain. On the one hand, we have Roads Must Fall. Churchill was a racist. The toppling of Colton into the River Avon. Windrush. Boris Johnson pushing an Empire 2.0. Conservatives hitching the wagon of Brexit to a 21st century imperial resurgence. And they had a willing electorate. They still do. Recently, nearly 60% of Britons, 90, just 60, when recently polled said empire was a force of good. Imperial history wars and their profound salience today. How did we get here? How do we in the present understand the past and the ways in which it shapes the world in which we're living today? To answer these questions, it's time to move our conversation beyond whether or not empire was a good thing or a bad thing, a force of evil or progress, to how and why coercion was a cornerstone of Britain's reformist agenda in the empire, its civilizing mission, its white man's burden. And that, I hope, is the journey that Legacy of Violence will take you on. It's a book that, for me, has been well over a decade, and that's an historian's decade, like 15 years, in the making. And the idea for it came from my last book, Imperial Reckoning, which sought to establish as fact that Britain deployed systematic violence in Kenya's 1950s detention camps and then covered up its own incriminating evidence. The book then became the evidentiary basis for the first time the British government has been sued by a former colonized population in London's High Court. And in 2013, it resulted in an unprecedented settlement of £20 million and an official apology from the British government to the Kenyan victims of British colonial rules. For me, though, questions remained. I dropped into this one moment in time in Kenya, and it was part of a much bigger story, a story where imperial agents circulated throughout the 19th and 20th century empire, where coercion and reform rested uncomfortably with each other and were bound together by British liberal imperialism. This liberal imperialism was thought to be unique. Its civilizing mission would bring developmentalism with a heavy paternalistic hand to 700 million colonial subjects across a quarter of the world's landmass, the largest empire history has ever known. But liberal imperialism, with its coercion and its reform, was an oxymoron, a dualism that can only be explained if we keep coercion and reform in the same frame of historical analysis. If we ask how and why coercion and reform were two sides of empire's developmentalist coin. And so I set out to research and write a story of British Empire through the lens of state-directed violence and the ways in which Britons at home and in the empire worked and reworked and understood colonial violence as part of the liberal imperial project. Put another way, violence, the law, and the state congeal during Britain's recurring crises of imperial legitimacy. And these crises often had dimensions beyond economic ones. And by moving away from arguments only about capitalism's sort of unremitting brutality, moving away from arguments squarely and solely in this context of racial capitalism, and make no mistake, I still believe that that has a cornerstone, but we have to move ourselves from that. And when we do, I argue that violence was inherent to liberalism. It resided in liberalism's reformism, its claims to modernity, its promises of freedom, and its notion of the law. Exactly the opposite places where one normally associates violence. And the book's concern is therefore less with sort of prosaic forms of coercion, as insidious as they were, than with the so-called exceptional and dramatic moments of physical and epistemological violence that accompanied the legitimacy crises and require the replacement of ordinary laws and policing with martial or statutory martial law and the deployment of security forces. And such violence included things like corporal punishments, deportations, detention without trial, forced migrations, killings, sexual assaults, tortures, and accompanying psychological terror, humiliation, and loss. And the book very much does not shy away from this. Because I'm seeking, as I said, to explain why and how Britain enacted these large-scale measures and the ways in which Britons understood, legitimated, and relegitimated them over almost 2 centuries. Now, the result, it's a book that reveals the bureaucratic and legal machinery of oppression, something I call legalized lawlessness, or the process of making legal otherwise illegal behavior, and therefore protecting British security forces from prosecution. The book also dissects liberal imperialism and really challenges recent historiographical and political defenses of British exceptionalism, and frankly just puncturing these myths of paternalism and progress and demonstrating liberal imperialism's perfidiousness across the empire. In the process of my research, which, as I said, spanned almost the lifetime of my children, they've been everywhere, where's Waldo on the map with my boys, but it also spanned 14 different research sites in a dozen different countries and in many ways generously funded. It wouldn't have happened without Weatherhead. And I expanded this temporal scope of my book in part to solve the problem of Britain's intentional acts of widespread document destruction and archival erasure. The extent of that became very apparent to us in the context of this High Court case in London. Because initially the book was really to focus on post-World War II. I was going to have about a chapter or so of introduction of the pre-World War II period. Now the pre-World War II period is about half the book. And in part, it's because I had to move this in temporal time frame in order to sort of work around this problem of sources or the knowledge that Britain had destroyed so many of them. And the book is bookended by 2 trials, the Warren Hastings trial in the late 19th century, then the Mau Mau trial, thank you, in the early 20th. And I really use this as a narrative device where we can sort of trace the evolution, the accretion of this long arc of what I call liberal imperialism, or sort of picking up on this notion of 19th century liberal imperialism and using it, as I say in the beginning of the introduction, which some purists, political scientists may feel is anachronistic, but ultimately with the hope, as I said, to bring us to a different kind of place in our debate, away from good or bad, the balance sheet of violence, as opposed to how and why this happened across time and space. So thank you so much.